Metroid Prime 4 finally arrives this year. After 8 painstaking years of waiting since the game's fateful E3 2017 announcement, and 18 years since Prime 3, it's easy to see why most gamers are not yet concerned with what lies beyond, well, beyond. However, if we pull ourselves out of the black hole of game release countdowns to examine the wider state of the franchise, it's easy to discover that Metroid might be primed for something of a second renaissance in the coming years. Now, you might be wondering when the first so-called renaissance was. We'll get to that in a moment. So in this video, let's analyze the likelihood and reasons behind a potential tidal wave of Metroid content we might still receive in this decade. Please consider subscribing or hitting that like button if you enjoy this video for more primetime content, and let's power up. Alright, so almost a year ago, I released a video about the insane decade of Metroid from 2001 to 2010. This video analyzes the staggering amount of Metroid content released during that time frame relative to the other decades of the franchise's history. 3 games in the Metroid Prime trilogy, Metroid Fusion and Zero Mission for GBA, Metroid Prime First Hunt, Full Hunters, and Pinball for the DS, as well as the trilogy re-release and Other M for the Wii, plus other smaller content pieces and major marketing efforts. This decade was on another level for Metroid fans before the franchise went almost dark for the next decade. In many ways, this decade created a renaissance for the franchise after an 8-year hiatus since Super Metroid, a period of great Metroid expansion and enlightenment in terms of gameplay, story, presentation, and awareness, though obviously the amazing Super Metroid originally led the way here. As we approach the midpoint of this decade in 2025 though, I can't help but notice parallels to the early 2000s and what that might mean for an expansion of Metroid content in the second half of the 2020s. This decade has already been surprisingly kind to Metroid, thanks to the momentum and massive Switch install base. Metroid Dread released in 2021, igniting the decade with a brand new Metroid that would go on to be the highest selling entry in the franchise. With only Samus Returns and the lackluster Federation Force released between 2011 and 2020, this renewed energy was desperately needed. This situation is sort of similar to what the original Prime delivered back in 2002 after the long gap since Super Metroid. Soon after Dread, we received re-releases of Metroid Fusion and Metroid Zero Mission on Switch Online in 2023 and 2024, sort of a parallel to the 2002 and 2004 releases of the games on GBA. Switch Online also received Metroid 2 in 2023, and the original Metroid was already available there from 2019, as was Super Metroid. And finally, 2023 also gave us the surprise major release of Metroid Prime Remastered, an epic upgrade that shadow dropped for many surprised fans. Prime Remastered notably also brought Retro Studios back from the grave in terms of their involvement with the Metroid franchise. So with the exception of Dread, the first half of this decade has essentially been about preserving and restoring the original Metroid games and making them accessible to a larger, newer audience. I'm hoping a secondary reason for this effort was to increase awareness of the franchise in anticipation of more releases. You see, I think there's actually some decent evidence that we might get multiple more Metroid remasters or ports, and more importantly, multiple brand new Metroid games beyond Prime 4 over the next 5 years. For starters, Prime 2 and 3 ports or remasters of some sort seem almost inevitable at this point, to make the entire trilogy playable on Switch before Prime 4. I have a couple videos on my channel about what this might look like. Check those out for deeper analysis. It's unclear whether we'll get a port of the entire original Wii trilogy or just individual Prime 2 and 3 ports, or more involved remasters somewhere between a basic port and Prime Remastered, but I do think it's likely that these games come to Switch and Switch 2 in some form. A combination of recent news and rumors seems to suggest that remasters of those 2 games were originally planned, but Retro ran out of time or resources to handle them themselves, which means they may have either gotten outsourced, put on hold, or will just end up getting really basic ports. There seems to be conflicting information around this. However, recent news of an art book releasing in summer 2025 that covers all 3 games seems to point to promotional materials lining up ahead of a later 2025 Prime 4 release and in time for some sort of Prime 2 and 3 release. Now, more interestingly, it seems like Metroid Prime 4 might not be the last Prime game. Nintendo appears to have endured significant trials and tribulations to get Prime 4 across the finish line. It seems unlikely that they would just abandon the franchise after that level of investment. Initially under development by Bandai Namco, Prime 4 was essentially restarted when it was handed off to Retro Studios in 2019. Prime 1 Remastered created an opportunity to bring the tech and the current Retro team up to speed and introduce the sub-series to a new audience. Now, just as importantly, the Prime game engine needed to be upgraded and modernized to work on Switch hardware and deliver upgraded visuals and gameplay. Prime 4 still runs on a modified version of the original engine, or at least components of it, which is kind of crazy to think about. In order to upgrade the engine and get Prime 4 out the door, Retro also went through a significant hiring spree based on the constant job listings on their site over the last few years fans have used to pseudo-track the game progress. Some of those new hires also included industry vets from game franchises like Call of Duty, Crysis, and Shadow of the Tomb Raider. This implies significant investment in both technology and personnel to get this franchise running again. It seems unlikely or even improbable that Nintendo would simply abandon that game engine technology and some or all of those hired team members after Prime 4, assuming it's even modestly successful. There's too much time and energy and money invested at this point. Yes, contracting work and temporary hires are common in the game industry, but this was clearly a significant investment, and not all of those listings were contractors. After this level of investment, creating Prime 5 or even 6 to complete a new trilogy would be potentially cheaper or more efficient than starting something else from the ground up again. Prime 2 and 3 had much shorter development life cycles than Prime 1 because the team and technology were ready to go. The fact that the Switch 2 is already confirmed to be backwards compatible also bodes well for sequels from a technology perspective. The existing engine will work mostly as is, and simply could be enhanced to take advantage of the new power and features. There's also a chance Prime 4 becomes the highest selling entry in the series, which would further increase the likelihood of Prime 5 or 6. By the time the game releases, there will be around 150 million Switches in the wild, and potentially millions more of enthused Switch 2 owners. If even a tiny fraction of that entire base picks up Prime 4, it will be the highest selling game in the franchise almost by default. There are way more Switch owners now than there were in 2021 for Dread, and first-person games debatably have a wider mainstream appeal than 2D Metroidvanias. Nintendo tried for a long time to make Metroid and the Prime series a bigger deal in terms of sales, but the GameCube sold poorly and arguably didn't allow the franchise to reach the popularity it deserved. This could be a second chance for the series. Thematically, I think Prime 4 also sort of implies there's some connective tissue that might span more than one game. Sylix has been around since Metroid Prime Hunters and had a cameo in Prime 3, and if he is indeed the new main bad guy instead of Dark Samus, there's a chance that story might span multiple games to reach a proper conclusion, just like with the last Nemesis. I'm not sure if this means there's a more direct continuation of story elements from the first three, which means they may or may not expand beyond Prime 4. Now, interestingly, people also seem to have stopped talking about when or if we're getting another 2D Metroid. I personally think that this is actually more likely than getting Prime 5 or 6 anytime soon. Dread currently is still the best-selling entry in the franchise after all. Mercury Steam, the developers of Dread, haven't released anything new since 2021. And before that, they obviously also released Samus Returns in 2017 and were involved in some other smaller projects as well. According to the latest news and rumors, they are currently working on 2 unannounced projects. One is Project Iron, a fantasy game developed in partnership with 505 Games, but the other project is unknown. Could this be Metroid 6, or the start of a new 2D Metroid sub-series, since the original story arc is supposedly done? Dread producer Sakamoto even stated that Dread wasn't Samus's ultimate end, though, and that Samus's adventure will continue. Mercury Steam also supposedly pitched Metroid game ideas to Nintendo at one point years ago, but it was unsuccessful. Perhaps some variation of those ideas will come back to life as a new Metroid title or sub-series. Assuming a 4 to 5 year development cycle, that would put some sort of 2D Metroid in 2025 or 2026, though I could see that getting pushed to 2027 to avoid any Prime 4 competition. Just like in the 2000s, we have Retro Studios developing the 3D Prime games, while another studio handles the 2D games in parallel. So I think it would be the Metroid dream if we received Prime 4 in 2025, some sort of new 2D Metroid in 2027, and then Prime 5 in 2029 or 2030. Combined with a release of all three original Prime games on Switch, classic Metroid games on Switch Online, Dread from 2021, the Prime Remastered release, all of this would culminate in a truly epic decade of Metroid that would nearly rival the early 2000s, something I thought we'd never see again after the Metroid dark days of 2011 to 2020. Now, obviously, some of this might just be wishful thinking, but what do you think? So please remember to subscribe and leave a comment with what you think the most likely scenario here is, and let's discuss.